audio on this to come on. Acts chapter 17 this evening, that's where we will be. Acts the 17th chapter as we continue on in our study of the missionary journeys of Paul. And so far, he's made it through his first journey, and we saw a lot of great things happen along that journey, of course. Many Jews were converted, even some Gentiles along the way also were converted. Likely a young man by the name of Timothy, when Paul first was in Lystra, Derbe, Iconium, that region. Timothy and his mother and grandmother likely would have heard the gospel, and that may have very well been when they had obeyed it. But we do know, as luck would have it, after he makes it back into Antioch, there came a time there, just before he would embark on his second missionary journey, where there is a great stir amongst the brethren, because some brethren from Jerusalem, who he refers to in the Galatian letter as false brethren, they came up causing a stir over circumcision, saying that it was a prerequisite into salvation. Well, that's the gist of what they were insinuating. So Paul and some others make their way down to Jerusalem. They heard the council. They make it a decision, and the decision was, no, it is not required to have salvation or to be a part of Christ. So Paul will carry that message, as well as letters along with him, signed likely by all the apostles, or at least noting everything that they had said as truth. And so they'd go from city to city and do that. Along the way, they pick up Timothy, though. Timothy, having a Grecian dad, was known to not have been circumcised within that city, but so that Timothy could be useful, unlike Titus, who grew up in a Greek culture, what does Paul do to Timothy? He takes him aside, and what does he do? He circumcises him. And that's so that he'll be effective or useful amongst the Jewish people that he would speak to in that area especially. So Silas and Paul are on this second journey, and Timothy, and they continue their way on into Troas, being prevented to go up into Bithynia or into the Asia region by the Holy Spirit. They make their way, and where are they headed from Troas? Across the water into what region? The region of Macedonia. Remember, he received a vision of this person calling out. And so he makes his way on over from Neapolis into Philippi. And while in Philippi, we note, of course, Lydia and the ladies there in her household, and how quick they were to obey the gospel after hearing the message. And what else do we note that happens at Philippi? Paul's arrest, right? He and Silas were arrested. Luke was likely there with them, but not in the jail cell with them. We don't read of Timothy being there. And we read about this earthquake that happens in the middle of the night, the jailer wanting to kill himself, but Paul says, no, we're still here, don't do that. And what happens with the jailer's household? With the jailer and his household? Yeah, they all obey the gospel. The jailer is baptized, as his household is. They believed. The church is strengthened there, and then he begins to depart, and he goes into Thessalonica. He rubs some people the wrong way, and he's kind of on the run at that point, likely leaving Timothy behind there in Thessalonica. Based on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, we can get that kind of idea, at least, that he may have been left behind, as well as we noted back there in Philippi. The pronouns changed from we, meaning Luke was likely with them, back to they. So Luke has been left behind at some point. And so Paul and Silas make it to Berea, and we noted last week about how they were more noble-minded than the Thessalonians were, because they searched what out daily? Yeah, they searched the scriptures daily. And why would they be doing that? Yeah, they want to make sure that everything lines up. So they're talking to some Jews at this point, and because these Jews who are searching the scriptures, they compare notes, they listen to what Paul has to say, and many of them, according to verse number 12, many of them believed. Now think about that. As they believe, we have some new converts. That's what's implied by that. And who comes along? Yeah, those Jews come up again. And are they exactly happy with him? No, they're ready to kill him, it seems, or at least, excuse me, or at least put him on trial there. And so they work their way in sending out Paul. And where do they send Paul? To Athens. And Silas and Timothy, they're left behind there in Berea, so there must not have been as much fear for them as there is for Paul's life, but Paul wants them there as quickly as possible. Athens, as we noted, was a place where there was a lot of ideas, a lot of philosophies, a lot of art, basically an anything can go type of a place. And while in the city that was full of idolatry, how does Paul feel? How does Paul feel about all the idolatry? Well, if you remember, they called him an idol babbler, and then he kind of gets his feathers ruffled a little bit to the point where he's seeing all these false gods, and in his preaching changes just a little bit. Up until this point, what was he telling people that we know of? What was his central message? Jesus Christ and him crucified. So in Acts 17, his message is now going to change, which is where we left off, because he's going to meet the people where they're at. And this is a group of people who are given to wanting to know about these gods, have a god to everything. So what do? They worship these false gods. And then he finds an idol, a shrine, an altar to the unknown God. And that is when he's going to begin his sermon there on the Areopagus, the place that's kind of leveled out up on top of a hill that he can go to and easily be heard. The Stoics, they're wanting to hear him. The Epicureans, they're wanting to hear him because he has a new teaching. So that's where we are this evening, Acts 17. We're in verse 22. Someone read for us. It's lengthy, 22 through 31.
Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant in the very things you worship, and this is what I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands, and he is not served by human hands, as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offsprings. Therefore, since we are God's offsprings, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead.
All right. Thank you for that. No longer reading. But that's his sermon there to the people. And he starts out by speaking to them, and he says, "You men of Athens." So he kind of calls them out right at the beginning. And his central message is about God, because the Athenian people believed in God, and they maintained, at least in part, some sort of worship, as the altar is inscribed to the unknown God. So he says they worship this God in ignorance. So as he goes through this sermon, he talks first perhaps about God being the true God. He's the creator. He's independent of men. And he doesn't have any need for you guys, really. And he also doesn't have any need for you to create an idol with your hands or by your art or by your sculpture. Instead, the point that he's making is that man, we are completely dependent upon God. We are dependent for our existence through him. And so with God ruling in the affairs of their daily life, he challenges them to draw near to that God, to seek him out. And how do the people, or what's being said about God there? He points about how God had one who was born, who was coming to this world so that we could be his children. And he wants these people, Paul is emphasizing to these people, since we are the offspring of God, do not conceive God as an object such as gold or made of gold or silver that needs to be worshipped, but rather see him as the creator, see him as that God. And so that God, what did he command men and women, people alike, everywhere? What did he command them to do? To repent. They needed to repent. And the reason is because God will judge all men. He will judge all men by the one that he has chosen, that being Jesus Christ. And he demonstrated that in Christ, in his choice, in the raising him of the dead, and in the promises that he has spoken unto us. So one of the questions that we've had is, what is the result of the preaching? What is going to be the result of that kind of strong word, that kind of strong message that's given? Well, there's always 2 or 3 different responses, right? The first response, or the first response that we want to say is a favorable response, and that is we believed. The second response that you might want to hear is, well, we'll hear you again on these matters. But what's the third response that you didn't want to have? Is any disbelief, or rather animosity, that might return. And they're going to drive him out. He's going to end up into Corinth and into Achaia, to that region there, as he begins and makes his way back home for his third journey because of some of those things. So let's keep reading. Someone read for us verses 32 to the end of the chapter.
Now when they heard the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, "We will hear you again about this." So Paul went out from their beds. Some men joined him and believed, among whom were also Dionysius,
We'll go with it.
and a woman named Damaris, and others
All right. Thank you there. Those are hard names to pronounce. I'm not even going to try. You did just as good as anyone else can with those today. And so we have these people that are mentioned. They're called out by name. We don't know a lot about them. One is a council member. The other is a woman, likely of prominence there within the city. And there's likely a variety of other people who are also converted there as well. And so we get to verse 1 of chapter 18, and it says that after these things, he leaves Athens, and where does he go? That's right, to Corinth. So he's going to Corinth. And we know a lot about Corinth, at least as far as history goes, as far as historical writers have recorded about the place, the morality of the city, and some of those things there. And overall, what do you think about the moral climate? What's the moral climate there? I wrote on the screen, terrible moral climate, but how could we define it? Think back to 1 Corinthians, right? Because that letter is going to be written fairly soon when Paul makes his way from Corinth over into Ephesus and would then write that back to them. So that's going to come up. And think about that long list that's found in 1 Corinthians 6 of just terrible, as far as what we describe as just terrible sins. Those are if we were ranking sins, which we shouldn't do to begin with, but if we were, the ones that are listed there, we'd say are all ranked pretty high. And what does Paul tell them? Such were some of you. But you've been washed, cleansed, sanctified, justified, reconciled. Okay? But there is still a big issue within the city. Issues of sin that are going to take place there. In particular, one of the issues or one of the sinful things that would take place there in Corinth is there was a temple that was devoted to the goddess Venus, or as it would also be referred to as Aphrodite, which was one of the fertility gods. And what they would have are these priestesses, these women who would serve as harlots within the temple. And people would go and pay their money. They would lie with them in hopes that that would solve their problems. It was a very large, very prominent trade route where a lot of trading back and forth, both from the east and the west, they would meet, they would come there, and then from there, a lot of the products would be dispersed. So it was a happening city, if we will. Jimmy.
It says here that Corinth was the capital of the Roman province.
Of Achaia there, yeah.
So, if it had anything to do with the Roman, I mean, it had to be corrupt, kind of.
That's right. And it was. There's not a lot good that you would really say about Corinth overall, if you're looking at the big picture. In fact, there were terms of being a Corinthian, which would mean you're just being a playboy of society. Or if you were to Corinthianize, that means you're spending time in ways that you should not be spending it. And so, I mean, it wasn't spoken of highly in that regard. But if you wanted to gain some money, if you wanted to make a name for yourself, that would be one of the key places to go at the time. And with a place such as that, that's full of sensual desires, would you think that the people there would respond well to the gospel? Well, you wouldn't think so, but there are some who do obey the gospel. A church will be established there at Corinth. In fact, we're going to read about two people who are brought up later on, Aquila and Priscilla. Now, they're not brought up as being disciples or being Christians. In fact, my Bible calls them a Jew named Aquila. But at some point, whether before or after they meet Paul, they do become Christians. And in fact, they're going to play a key role later on with a man by the name of Apollos. Remember Apollos? He's going to come up. I believe he's in the he's here at the end of this chapter, and we'll meet him again later on. So let's keep reading. Someone read for us verses 1 through 4. Acts 18, verses 1 through 4.
After these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome, and he came to them. So because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks.
All right, thank you. All right, so by the mention of the name Claudius, that helps us with our timeline of things, right? Sometimes we wonder, well, when was he there? What year was he there? We can't say specifically always this year, this year, this year. But when you start talking about a specific emperor named Claudius, well, that leads us to 41 to 54 AD with his reign. And then you want to talk about a specific decree. Well, now we're looking perhaps a little bit after AD 49 on into AD 50, around that time, maybe even just a little bit later towards the end of his reign. But that helps us see about what time, what year Paul is there in Corinth. And what did Claudius do? What was the decree that he made?
Wanted all the Jews out.
Yeah. Why would he want all the Jews out? Any ideas? Well, imagine if you're the emperor and you're dealing with a bunch of people who are always bringing and nagging you about a problem with these people called of the sect called the Way. You think that would get old? Well, one commentator wrote, several pages on that had to be why. Because the Jews were constantly coming to those who were over them to punish these people who were perverting their teachings, who were changing, who were causing a stir. And so several commentators suggest that Claudius would be getting rid of these Jews because they were bringing up one dispute after another, causing these kinds of problems. And that very well may be the case. But notice the people that Paul aligns himself with, and their names Aquila and Priscilla. What's their trade? What's their work? They're tent makers. They do the same thing, so it makes sense. Look, I know how to help you out. You know how to help me out. Let's work hand in hand together while we're trying to figure out some things, because this guy's also being dispersed as well, he and Priscilla. They're being dispersed because it said they were Jews. Maybe they're Christians already, maybe they're not, but they grew up as Jews. And so where does he go? Every Sabbath day, where does Paul go? Yeah, to the synagogues. And I imagine Aquila and Priscilla would be right alongside of him as well. And eventually when Silas and Timothy make their way down from Macedonia, remember they were left behind. They don't meet him there in Athens, and if they do, they go back up and then they come down. So, what happens? Are the Jews going to be persuaded? No. In fact, we're going to read in the next few verses that they blasphemed God, right? They resisted. And so Paul's going to do the very thing that Jesus commanded his disciples to do when someone would resist the message. All right, so let's read Acts 18, verses 5 through 11. Acts 18, 5 through 11. Someone read that for us.
But when Silas continued to attend them from Macedonia, Paul began to those that were to the word, following the
All right, thank you. So as we make our way through that text, we learn that Paul, when he'd go there, and Silas and Timothy make their way down, the first thing that he's going to do inside those synagogues is preach what? Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus was or is the Christ. And their response, with blaspheming there, with resisting, shaking their garments, or he shakes out his garments there, and he gives this line, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am clean. From now on, I'm going to the Gentiles." Think about those first two lines of that phrase that he says. What does he mean when he says, "Your blood is on your heads"?
Whatever happens to them.
He's not responsible. I have no more responsibility on your behalf. I've done everything. I've pleaded with you Sabbath after Sabbath, and enough's enough. You can only run into a brick wall so many times until you realize you're not going to get through, and you got to either walk around it or climb over it, right? So that's what was happening there, and he says, I am going to turn to the Gentiles. That's going to be my main focus now. And the Lord's going to speak to him, tell him, look, we've got many people here. You don't need to worry. Just keep on. Keep on keeping on. In fact, we learned about the leader of the synagogue. And what did it say about the leader of the synagogue? His name's Crispus.
His entire household believed in the Lord.
Yeah, he and his whole household believed the Lord, as with many of the Corinthians. That included all those idolaters, all those who were fornicators, the homosexuals, the thieves, the drunkards that are mentioned over in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, the people who were not associated with the synagogues by any means, but it says they were converted, they believed, they obeyed, they changed their way, their pagan way, and so now they are going to follow the Lord. Do we know anything about this man by the name of Titus Justus? Well, we don't know a lot about him as far as from biblical sources, but extra biblical sources tell us that he was likely a very prominent man within the city, had a prominent family, and most sources would say that he was a proselyte of the gate, and that means that he was not circumcised. He did not keep all of the restrictions of the law, but he believed in God, and so he would serve in that capacity, almost as a ruler of the synagogues from time to time. And then we have that man named Crispus, who's mentioned as an elder of the synagogue or as a leader of the synagogue. And what can we learn from that? What can we learn from him being an elder or a leader or a ruler of the synagogue? Well, he's one of prominence.
People follow him.
People are going to follow him. They're going to take his words to heart. Crispus likely could have been of a high-ranking official there by calling him out to be the ruler or the elder, to bring him up by name, because sometimes they would have a presiding elder who would be over all the other elders there within their synagogues at that time, the Jewish synagogues. So that wouldn't be uncommon if that was him or not, but we don't know. But within his authority, within the rejection of some of the other people, we find him here. And he and his household and these Corinthians, they believe. So notice everything that took place there within that short section. Paul preaches, he teaches, testifying Jesus is the Christ. Did the people believe? Some of them did. Perhaps many did. What do they do? According to 1 Corinthians 6, and such were some of you, so we can assume they repented of their sin. Then, verse 8, they were baptized. Why would they be baptized? 1 Corinthians 6 says that it was in their baptism that they were washed, sanctified, and justified. So we know that their baptism is for the remission of their sins. And then what is he going to do? If we follow the plan of Matthew 28, he's going to teach them to observe everything that the Lord commanded. And how long did he stay there within the city? He settled, and it was a year and a half, 1 year and 6 months, one of his longest stays at a specific location. And so he would write letters to them later on, and would likely write some other letters from Corinth at that time. Most would agree that he would definitely write 1st and 2nd Thessalonians at this point as well, to write back to those brethren and send that by the hands of Timothy, And so we'd have that going on. So following that, let's keep going in the storyline there. We're at verse 12. Someone read for us verses 12 through 17.
But when Gallio was proconsul of the Jews, made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, "This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law." But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of question about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things." And drove them from the tribunal. And they all seized
Sosthenes.
the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of this.
All right. So what's going on now? We have some Jews that have come up, and how do they feel? How do these Jews feel at this time? What does it say about them? Are they exactly happy with Paul? No. They're going to the leader in town, a man by the name of Gallio. Don't know a lot about him, proconsul of Achaia. And they're complaining. True Jewish fashion, they are complaining. And their complaint is that this guy he's just teaching all sorts of things that's just wrong. And does Gallio have anything to do with it? He said, no. I don't have any time for this at all. So what does he do? What does he tell them? Deal with it yourselves. I'm not putting up with your foolishness. I'm done. Go on. And so he sends them their merry little way, and we read of a man, this is the first time he comes up, a man by the name of Sosthenes, there in Acts 18. And Sosthenes, what's going on? What do they do to him? They take him outside and they beat him. Why? Why are they beating this guy? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us really, does it? So we could speculate for a little while. We know where he's sitting. Maybe he is the guy who's supposed to be leading, like their lawyer there before Gallio, and maybe he just did a poor job of pleading the case there of this is what we need being done. And so they just drag him outside and let him have it because he didn't do his job very well. Maybe that was why. Maybe it's because he himself was being persuaded by some of the statements of Paul. We don't know why they do it, but notice who are doing it. Who is beating Sosthenes?
Leader of the synagogue.
No, that's who he is.
Oh.
Who's beating him? Who's taking him out there to beat him? To beat him up? The Jews, the people who've been complaining this whole time. And let me ask this. Is that how their law worked? Gallio tells them, go, you have your laws. You just go follow your law. Go on. Is that how their law works? Oh, we don't like you. We don't like what you've just done. We're going to take you outside and beat you for it. That's not how it works, is it? No, we've read our Old Testaments a few times, I'm sure, and that's not how it works at all. So they're just acting in anger and frustration. But notice Gallio in his response to that. His first response is, I don't have time for all this. His second response to what they've just done is, still don't have time for it. He just ignores it. Oh, he just thinks they're crazy, I guess. And so we look at these last few verses, and then we'll close our Bible study tonight. In verse 18, we'll pick up the third journey next week. But let's finish up this section. Paul, having remained many days longer, took leave of the brethren and put out to sea for Syria. All right, so he's been there a year and a half. Maybe that is a part of this, many days, or maybe this is a few more days after the year and a half. I don't know for sure about that timeline at that point, but he leaves and he goes for Syria. With him, Priscilla and Aquila. In Cenchreae, he had his hair cut, for he was keeping a vow. So who was keeping the vow? I think if we're reading context, we're led to believe Paul is taking this vow. And what vow would he have taken initially or what vow would he likely have taken that would have required him to grow his hair out long? The Nazirite vow, right? So maybe that's what took place there. And so he begins to make his way towards Jerusalem. So they came to Ephesus. He left them there. Now he himself entered the synagogues and reasoned there with the Jews. And when they asked him to stay for a longer time, he did not consent, but taking leave of them and saying, I will return to you again if God wills, he set sail from Ephesus. So let's stop there for just a second, diagnose some of that. Ephesus is where most believe he would send the letters back to Corinth, especially 1 Corinthians as we would have it. That's when he likely would have sent that back to them. And remember what he said in Corinth? He's done with the Jews. He's focusing on the Greeks. Where does he go when he gets to Ephesus? I'm not calling him a liar. That's not what I'm doing. The Jews were the easy people to talk to about this because they are the people who should believe. They are the people who have had the law, the prophets. They should know. That's his safety net. But as he is there, they want him to stay longer. So why doesn't he? Why doesn't he stay longer? It doesn't really tell us whether he didn't consent. He didn't want to, or he had other things that he needed to do at that point. He needed to get back. Maybe his funds were running low. We don't know why. But he says, I want to come back. If the Lord wills, I will be back. I will visit with you. In fact, he will come back later on, but he will also write to them as well as time will pass. And that's another good letter that he has. So verse 22, he leaves Ephesus and he goes to Caesarea. He went up and greeted the church. Now when it says that, that likely means that he made his way on in to Jerusalem. Now, let's see, I'm trying to get there because whenever you say I'm going up, that in the Bible that's usually referring to they've gone up to the hill country, meaning they've gone up into Jerusalem. The church, of course, was there, and so that's likely where he went when it says that, even though it shows that he goes south from Caesarea, from the port city there to Jerusalem. And then where does he go? He went down. But he goes north. He's leaving the hill country, so he's going downhill to where? To Antioch of Syria. And so that's where he'll spend a little bit of time before he begins his third journey, and he's going to learn about a man, a Jew by the name of Apollos, who's teaching the baptism of John, not the baptism of Jesus Christ. So Lord willing, we'll pick up there next time. Any other questions or comments up until that point? All right then. Well, let me pause this, and then we'll move to our final moments here this evening.